Welcome back to Faith After Faith, the YouTube channel and podcast that explores the terrain between losing your faith and finding it again. I'm your host, Katie Langston, and today I want to talk a little bit about faith deconstruction and family relationships, because I think that of all of the things that you go through when you have a faith crisis or a deconstruction, this might be among the most difficult and the most fraught. At least I can say that was the case for me. I think a huge part of the pain and anxiety and the shame and the upheaval and everything that comes from experiencing such a dramatic shift in your worldview has to do with the way people in your life might respond when you share with them that you are going through this. So in my work with folks, this is something that we talk about all the time. Like, how do I deal with my mom? How do I deal with my spouse? How do I deal with my siblings? How do I deal with my friends? Do I tell them? Do I not tell them? To what extent should I try to work through this? Why are they texting me their, testimony constantly or arguing with me about theology? And the reality is that often this is not a symmetrical situation, right? Because you have gone through a shift in the way you think about things and the way you understand things that your loved ones have not. And so you can kind of empathize with their position and situation, but they have a very difficult time empathizing with yours sometimes. And I have a very dear friend who has this thing that she says whenever we're talking about, the various dramas and conflicts or whatever that we're experiencing in our lives. And she always says to me, Katie, it is never about what it's about. Usually there's something going on that's much deeper. And a framework that I found extremely helpful to try to excavate what's actually going on is Amanda Ripley's High Conflict. This is a book I read, 6 years ago. I think it was during the pandemic, probably because the entire world had gone crazy and everyone was mad at each other all the time. I think we're still there. But anyway, I read it to try to make sense of what was going on in the world, and I found that it was actually maybe the most helpful thing I read at all about understanding family relationships and personal relationships after a faith deconstruction or crisis. And one of the things that she talks about here is that high conflict is when the conflict takes over everything and the original issues fade and everyone ends up worse off. And there is a difference for Ripley between good conflict and high conflict, because the goal isn't no conflict. That's not a thing. That doesn't exist. Anytime you have human beings in proximity with one another, there's going to be conflict. People have different priorities. They have different ways of seeing the world. They have different ideas about what's important. There's no such thing as a conflict-free existence. I don't know, for my fellow Mormons out there where contention was the spirit of the devil or whatever. I think sometimes we assume that contention and conflict were synonymous, but I don't think they are. I don't think that's a very helpful way to think about it, because I think a lot of us, I would say women, especially, maybe, although I've known some highly conflict avoidant men as well, tend to be pretty conflict avoidant. We want to, just go along to get along. But that's not healthy either. So the question here isn't how to avoid all conflict, but the question is how to tell whether you're having a good conflict or a high conflict, and then maybe how to steer back from one to the other. So good conflict can be serious and intense, but usually it leads somewhere. When you're in conflict, when you're debating, when you're arguing, there is progress being made. And probably most importantly, it never collapses into dehumanization. In other words, you always know and can keep in mind that the person that you're in a conflict with is a human. Right? You're not objectifying them in order to make them lesser. High conflict, on the other hand, is self-perpetuating, all-consuming, and us versus them, where almost everyone ends up worse off. And part and parcel of high conflict is that you do begin to dehumanize the person. You begin to cast them as a villain. You have less ability or capacity to see them with empathy or to even imagine yourself in their point of view. When you begin to feel that sort of hostility toward someone else, I think that's a clue that you're entering kind of high conflict territory, and maybe a cue to yourself to sort of take a step back and see what's really going on there. Now, Ripley says that there's something of a paradox here, in that we are animated by high conflict and we're also haunted by it, and that we want it to end and we want it to continue. at the same time. I think there's sort of a charge that you get from being in high conflict, whether it's a sense of self-righteousness or self-justification, or I'm right and they're wrong and I'm good and they're bad, that sort of all or nothing binary. There's a sort of pleasure almost that comes from wanting to continue to engage in the conflict, even while at the same time you know that it's not good for you and you really probably should let it go. So keep your eyes open for that. Now, I said earlier that whenever you're in a conflict, especially a high conflict, but really any kind of charged situation, it's almost never about what it's about. A great example of this that Ripley tells in the book was about a couple going through a divorce, and they just got into this insanely acrimonious conflict over this Lego set that their kid had, right? It was just knives out, guns blazing, this argument over who was going to get the Lego set. And of course, it wasn't about the Lego set, right? Either one of them could have gone out and purchased an identical Lego set. What it was really about was that that was their kid's favorite toy. And they felt like whichever of them had the Legos would be the recipient of the child's love and affection. So it had nothing to do with the Legos. It had everything to do with the reality that their family system was breaking up, and they were feeling broken and shattered by that. And they were afraid of what might happen to their relationship with their kid in the process. And that is what Ripley in the book calls an understory. An understory is what's really going on beneath what's going on. What's the thing underneath that, right? And she says that there usually are 4 of them. And so I'll share those now and then maybe also talk just a little bit about what might be going on underneath that when we're thinking about the situation of a faith deconstruction where one of you has started to change how you think about faith and the other hasn't. So the first is power and control. This can sound kind of ominous, like this person just wants to control me or have power over me. And I think there are situations where that's true, where there are truly abusive people who are actually literally seeking to have power and control over you. But a lot of times what it's about is the sense of power and control that the person has over their own life. This is a chaotic world. It's unpredictable. Spoiler alert, everyone will die, right? It's scary. It's not easy. And our beliefs for many people, and especially people who haven't gone through a kind of deconstruction process or whatever, for many of those folks, that is what brings order to the chaos. And so when you say, actually, this doesn't work for me anymore, actually, I don't think that makes sense, that can throw the other person into a sense of powerlessness and a loss of control. Now, the reality is none of us has power and control over each other or the universe or whether or not the sun comes up in the morning, right? But we like to feel as if we do. We all do this. And so a lot of times when you're in a high conflict with someone, especially as you're leaving a faith tradition that you used to share, one possible understory has to do with power control. Another possible understory is respect and recognition. So people in my life looked at my decision to step away from the Mormon tradition, not as a rejection exactly of that tradition, but as a rejection of them. Or there was this sort of sense, well, if you are leaving, then you must think that the church is stupid. And if you think that the church is stupid and I believe in the church, you must think that I'm stupid. Or do you think less of me now? Do you think I'm a fool? Right? For believing this. I think a lot of times as someone is leaving a tradition, you can kind of get this sense of like, well, this is all bullshit. And so people who believe this are idiots or whatever, And I think sometimes we on the leaving side might perpetuate some of this sense of losing respect or recognition for the other. So I think that's a particularly salient one. Third, the understory might be care and concern. This is where they think you're walking toward harm. And alarm is the only language or emotion they can access around that. They are worried genuinely for the state of your eternal soul. We don't want you in hell. We want you with us in heaven, right? So I think this is something that can be very powerful. And then finally, the fourth kind of understory is often stress and overwhelm. And, high demand traditions can be overwhelming. They are high demand for a reason. People feel like they have to do any number of things in order to be okay, to be in the club, to be good with God, whatever it is. And sometimes at certain seasons of life in particular, you can kind of feel like you're drowning when you're in the middle of it. And people with no capacity can't be curious if they have no emotional energy left. I mean, think about if your spouse still wants to bring the kids to church and you are walking away, all of a sudden, all of the stress of getting everyone up and ready and out the door and, doing all the things now falls on the spouse who is staying. And so sometimes behind that is just the sense of being completely overwhelmed now by the demands. So, think about that in your own relationships. Like what's really going on underneath? And once you're able to begin to excavate the understory, you can actually begin to have the conversations that are about what the thing is really about, right? So let's take as a case study the example of deciding not to go to church on Christmas, right? And so the fight on the surface is like, I can't understand why you won't come to church with us on Christmas. We've always done this. What are you doing, right? So you could engage in the argument about Christmas, or you could ask the question, what understory is going on beneath this? Is it a control understory? This isn't mine to decide anymore, and that's scary. Is it a respect understory? Do you secretly think I'm a fool for believing in this and wanting to go to church on Christmas? Is it a care understory? Actually, your soul is in real danger, and I'm worried about that. Is it a stress understory? How will everything get done that needs to get done? Like what's really going on underneath that argument? And there's a reason that faith conflicts can be so high conflict. I wish this weren't the case. You would hope that faith would actually help de-escalate high conflict. But unfortunately, that is not always the case. And that's because faith really is like the person's whole operating system, especially in a high demand tradition, especially when you're all the way in. When you're in, and it defines your worldview and your social network and your moral framework and your calendar and your identity and your family's identity and everything. And so a disruption in that causes disruption across the entire operating system. And it can bring to bear all of the understories all at once, perhaps. And that's because this is these are questions of ultimate meaning. What really matters? How do we make sense of the world? How do we know who we are to one another, right? How do we know that we're loved? And so, of course, a disruption in our sense of faith is going to disrupt not only our own identity, we talked about that in a couple of previous videos, but also the identity and the family system or the community system or whatever writ large. And so have some empathy for that. Have some empathy for yourself. You're going through a major disruption, but also have some empathy for your loved ones who are also going through it. So what do we do with all of this? Well, one thing is to remember another paradox, which is that no one changes until they believe you understand and accept them just as they are right now. That's just how it is. Of course, sometimes not even then because, we can't change people, but certainly people are much less likely to bend or give in a relationship if they don't feel safe to do so. Think about the kind of response that you wish you were getting to your decision to either step away from a tradition or to rethink your theology or whatever it is. And remember that same thing that you wish you got, that's what they're wishing for as well. I think there are 4 things that really do help. And one is to name the understory. Name it for yourself. Like when you're activated about the Christmas fight, name for yourself what's really going on there. And then also try to name the understory or understand the understory that's going on for the other person. If you can, talk to them about this concept of understories and get curious together about what's actually underneath it. I know not every relationship you're able to have or want to invest that kind of in-depth processing and exploration together, but if you can, share this video or share these ideas with the person that you're in conflict with and see if together you can excavate what's really going on. Number 2 is don't try to win the argument, right? Remember that that what you want is to be loved and accepted as you are, and what the other person wants is to be loved and accepted as they are. And until that kind of foundation is established and until there's trust there, no one's going to give. Go slow. I've seen folks blow up their lives and relationships coming out of a tradition, and I think everyone is served by taking your time and having the hard conversations and finding some healing before you make any kind of dramatic life choices. And then finally, get help, right? You don't have to do this alone. There are therapists out there who can help. There are faith leaders, pastors who have experience with this sort of thing. There are support groups. There are people around that can walk with you through this. And so don't try to do it alone. This isn't the kind of thing that you can just, intuit your way through. It takes support, and community really, really helps with that. And of course, I would suggest try to find where grace is in the midst of it. How do you show up with grace? How do you experience grace? How do you bring grace to bear on the situation? And I always say that the opposite of grace is shame. And so shame says someone has to be at fault. There's someone to blame for this. And that's all. You can always see that on both sides, right? You just wanted to sin, or the church is so bad, or whatever. What if you could set aside the blame and instead ask the question, given this reality, how do we love each other? How do we show up for each other in this moment? How do we listen to each other? How do we forgive each other? How do we hear each other? Now, keep in mind, grace is not the absence of accountability. Harmful behavior doesn't get a pass, and you don't have to stay in a relationship that is actively hurting you, right? If someone is being abusive, if someone is being deeply controlling, if someone is treating you in ways that are dangerous or unsafe, forgiveness does not always entail reconciliation. But I think a lot of times it does, and it can, because most people, not everyone, but most people are just trying their best. However, there are situations where you may need to set a firm boundary, and you should do that to protect yourself if you need to. At the bottom of it all, I can't help but wondering if the deepest understory actually here is love. Disordered, misdirected, sometimes harmful, but love, right? That underneath that is the sense of, hey, I relied on you to help me know I was okay. And now that's being disrupted and I'm destabilized and I don't know what to do because I love you, because you're an important person in my life, because who you are is foundational to who I am, because we're human beings and we need each other. And so as you go through this, try to keep that in mind. Again, it doesn't mean excusing terrible behavior, but if it is possible to experience some empathy and some love for them, and also some empathy and some love for yourself as you go through it, I think that can really help. Coming up, I'll be releasing an episode with Lindsay Hansen-Park. She's a dear friend of mine, executive director of Sunstone, and just a really smart person who has thought a lot about family systems, cultural systems, systems of shame, or whatever, particularly in Mormonism. So we're going to be talking a lot about, boy, what do you do and how might you navigate these family relationships as you're going through a faith deconstruction with the kind of empathy and love that we talked about today. As always, thank you so much for being with us here on Faith After Faith. If you would like to support the show, you can go to katielangston.com/support, and there for whatever amount you would like to give per month, you can get access to exclusive bonus content, early release of episodes, and full unedited interviews and conversations. That's just one way to kind of help spread the word about this work. As always, please like and subscribe or rate and review. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay if this podcast was helpful for you is to share it with a friend. Until next time, thanks for being with me on Faith After Faith.